Hey everybody, it's Miss Howell. I'm trying to get this video recorded for you guys. We're on practice round 3, so let's see if I can get done it this time. All right, so we're going to talk about the respiratory system, which is module 14, the first half of the chapter. Look for the red words to fill in your guided notes. I'm probably going to skip a little bit, but all of it's here on the slides. We'll talk about it in class, but if you need to pause your video and get the words written down for your guided notes, so you'll have those to study. But we'll talk a little bit about these different diseases that we're going to come up against in class because I won't have enough time here. So the last module we studied was digestion. And in digestion we learned that you have to break down the molecular components of your food to eat so that you can get those very tiny nutrients to move into the cells so that your cells can do the work that they need to do. They need the power and the energy. Well, the energy that they use is ATP, and to make ATP, your body goes through a process called aerobic cellular respiration, and that process needs oxygen. So this week we're talking about how the respiratory system provides the tissue with the oxygen it needs to be able to make ATP. So in this module, we're going to also focus on 4 primary functions of the respiratory system. You have olfaction, voice, ventilation, and respiration. So the anatomy is the first thing we want to look at. So I'm going to go through this quickly. You can always pause and come back and look again. And then we're going to talk about the functions of each part. The entire respiratory system is divided into 2 parts. You've got the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system. The upper is your nasal cavity, your paranasal sinuses, and your pharynx, which is your throat. The lower respiratory system is everything below that that's involved in your breathing. So that's going to be your larynx, your trachea, the bronchi, and your lungs. Take a look at this picture and you'll see that the bronchial tubes branch into smaller and smaller and smaller tubes and eventually end in your alveoli. And we'll talk about that in class and we'll actually draw some of that out. Those 4 primary functions that we mentioned are really important, but every single part of the respiratory system has its own functions. Nothing is meaningless, so we're going to start at the top and we're going to work our way down through all of these. So the nasal cavity's primary function is the sense of smell, which is called olfaction. But another function of your nasal cavity is to help moisten, warm, and clean the air that comes into your body. The pharynx, we talked last week, helps to aid proper passage of food into the stomach, down the esophagus. Remember we talked about that last week? Well, it's also really important that it allows air to move into the trachea. The larynx is your voice box. Larynx is a fancy word for voice box, and it's what helps you to be able to speak and sing and whisper and etc. The trachea, moving further down, is your windpipe, and it's just the direct route to the lungs. Its function is ventilation. That word is important, so put a star by that one. Ventilation is the process of getting air in and out of your lungs. At the bottom of your trachea, it branches into 2 bronchi. There's the right bronchus and the left bronchus. The right is a little bit bigger because it moves to the right lung. Your right lung has 3 lobes, whereas your left lung, so the left bronchus is smaller because the left lung only has 2 lobes. The reason for that is the fact that your left lung is part of that space is taken up by your heart. Your heart is positioned in a way that it takes up a little space on that side of your body. The bronchiole is a little bit smaller branch as we move through your lung tissue until we terminate at the alveoli. And the alveoli is where everything really happens in the lungs. The alveoli is where respiration takes place, that gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli space and the blood in your body. And that happens within the lungs itself. Then you also have this internal respiration that's going on at the cellular level within your body. And we talked about that once before, and I know you studied that in biology last year, so I'm not even going to touch on that much this week. So think about a carbon dioxide molecule. I want you to read this question to yourself, pause the tape, and see if you can't answer this question by putting these structures in the correct order. Here's a diagram to see if you got it correct. So starting at the bottom, you've got the alveoli, and the carbon dioxide molecule is trying to work its way out of your body. So it needs to go from the alveoli and exit via the nasal passage. So you look and see if you've written these in the right order. You've got the alveoli, bronchial tubes, the trachea, the larynx, the pharynx, and then the nasal cavity. So hopefully you got those in the right order. So now we're going to take a minute and talk about voice. So you've probably heard that the sounds that you produce, like my speaking that you're having to listen to, comes through my vocal cords, right? Well, did you know you have two sets of them? The first set is positioned at the top of your larynx, the voice box. Those are called the false vocal cords, and that's because they don't form voice at all. They're there to close the larynx to stop food from ending up in your lungs. They also close when you hold your breath. Try this. Try to swallow and breathe at the same time. Can't do it. You can't breathe in or out and swallow at the same time. And it's to protect you from getting anything in your lungs that doesn't belong there. Now, the second set of cords are your true vocal cords. They're the ones that actually produce sound, and they never close completely. They're there to vibrate as air passes past them. The vibration of the air moving past them produces sound. Think about a guitar. As the strings vibrate on a guitar, sound is produced. Now consider what happens if you pluck a string really hard. It makes the sound louder. You can control the volume of your voice by controlling how much air passes through the larynx, just like plucking harder on a guitar string. That explains why when you want to yell at somebody really loudly, you've got to take a deep breath to let more air pass through your vocal cords. To change pitch on a guitar string, you just pinch off the string at different points on the neck of the guitar. Varying the length of the string varies the frequency that the string vibrates. The shorter the string, the higher the frequency, the higher the note. Tightening the string has the same effect. More tension is the higher pitch. Well, your vocal cords respond the same way. You can't reach in and change the length of your vocal cords. But when you were little, your vocal cords were shorter than they are now. So your voice, as you get older and your vocal cords get longer, the voice gets deeper. That's why a boy's voice changes so drastically during and after puberty, because there's a big difference in the length of their vocal cords. While you can't really change the length of your vocal cords, you can change the tension in your vocal cords as air moves past. So the higher the tension, the higher the chord. Sorry, the lower the tension, the looser the vocal cords, the lower the note. So you can do that on your own. So another two things that are involved in voice are resonance and articulation. Resonance just has to do with air vibrating within body chambers, like within your chest cavity and your sinuses and your oral cavity. And articulation is using your teeth, your tongue, your lips to form words and sounds with your mouth. We've already talked about the fact that ventilation is moving air in and out of the lungs, but how does it happen? Well, a lot of muscles are involved. The primary one is your diaphragm. Your diaphragm, we talked about last week, is that shelf of muscle, that layer of muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. So when you exhale or blow out, the diaphragm muscle relaxes. When that relaxes, the muscle lifts upward slightly. When you inhale, that muscle is contracted, which makes it shorter, and it pulls it downward. As the diaphragm pulls downward, the thoracic cavity, this chest space, gets larger. It increases in size. When that happens, the lungs inside are forced to expand. When you expand those lungs, it causes air to rush in to fill that space through your nasal cavities and your mouth. There's also some other muscles involved in inhalation. These others are there to expand the rib cage. That further increases the thoracic cavity so that it allows for inhalation to take place. And you also have something called forced inhalation. You can force yourself to take a very deep breath by increasing the size of your rib cage. To exhale, remember, you just relax. So exhaling is just relaxing all those inhalation muscles. When you relax these muscles, the rib cage pushes back in, the diaphragm rises back up, and those things make the lung space smaller, and that squeezes air out of the mouth and the nasal cavity. So principal exhalation doesn't require any muscle contraction, but to force additional air out of your lungs, you have to use muscles of forced exhalation. And you can try this yourself. Put your hands over your abdomen. Lift my. So put your hands over your abdomen and breathe normally in and out. Just and feel your hands move forward and back. And when you contract the muscles of your abdomen, though, forcefully, doing that causes your abdominal contents, the things within your belly, to rise up because you're squeezing in those muscles. And when you squeeze in those muscles, it pushes everything in up, and that pushes against the diaphragm, and that pushes everything and squeezes in and reduces the volume of your lungs, and that pushes air out of your chest. So that's a forced exhalation. Think about a balloon. Air moves from areas of high pressure to low pressure. Atmospheric air around an empty balloon that might be laying on your table isn't high enough to fill the balloon. You've got equal amounts of pressure on each side, so nothing happens. So you've got to take air from your chest, from your lungs, and blow into the balloon to inflate it. But as soon as you inflate that balloon, the pressure inside the balloon is higher than the pressure in the room. So if you move the balloon away from your mouth and let go of the opening, all the air in the balloon rushes out. Your lungs do the same thing. That relaxed, raised diaphragm decreases the volume or space in the balloon. When that pressure goes up as it's moving the diaphragm in, it's causing a higher pressure in the chest, and it's making you open your mouth and letting air out into the surrounding atmospheric pressure that is lower than what was in your lungs. So air moves out of your mouth and nose into the space. So here's a quick recap. To exhale is just to relax. To inhale requires contraction of the diaphragm. In addition to these muscles that are driving this inhalation, exhalation, ventilation process, there's some other things involved as well. Number one is you've got elastic fibers in the lungs. The tissue of your lungs is able to inflate with air because it's elastic like a balloon. But when the air is out, it recoils back to the original size like a balloon. It recoils back when all the air leaves, it falls back to its original size. Like a rubber band is elastic. When you let go, it pops back to its original place. Have you ever heard of the disease emphysema? Well, we'll talk about that in class. It has to do with a reduction in elasticity. Alveolar fluid is another thing that affects your ability to breathe out. Alveolar fluid is just the mucus that lines the inside of all those alveoli, those little pockets at the end of your lungs. This provides a damp surface that's mostly made of water. That surface tension exists because of the water molecules, and that pulls on the alveoli, further contracting the alveoli so that squeezes the air out of the far recesses of your lungs. There's a condition called pneumothorax that we'll talk about in class as well. We'll save that for class, but you can fill out your guided notes by looking at the slide. Just hit pause and get these filled out, and we'll talk about this in class. Surfactant is another factor that prevents lungs from collapsing. Surfactant is just a molecule that has a hydrophobic end and a hydrophilic end. Surfactant helps to decrease the surface tension of that mucus lining on the inside. When a baby is premature, say a baby's born a month early, well, what happens is they don't breathe well. Usually they say they don't want a baby to deliver until term, until they're fully developed, because they're concerned about their lungs being ready to breathe. In a premature baby, they struggle to breathe because their body has not yet started creating surfactant. And so babies can die of exhaustion because they're not able to let their lungs re-expand, and so they have a really hard time struggling to take in a breath. And since we're talking about babies, let's end our lesson today with this little tiny bit about what happens to a baby when they're first born. Before birth, the baby gets all their oxygen and nutrients from their mother. They don't breathe. But as soon as they're born and their umbilical cord is cut, they have to take their first breath. And it's said that a baby's first breath is the hardest they'll ever take. And that's because the compliance of the lungs, the stretchability, is low. Compliance is just the ease with which the lungs can inflate, kind of like a new balloon. The first time you blow up a new balloon, it's really hard. But after you've blown it up a time or two, let the air in and out, it's very compliant. All right, we're done. So bring questions to class.